What's up, everyone, and welcome back to MoAn Inc. If you are new here, then hello! My name is Erica. It's a pleasure to have you joining me today on the channel. Because for today's video, as you can see from the title, we are chatting to my friend and author extraordinaire, Bea FITZGERALD. Now, actually, Bea and I started being friends when she released Girl, Goddess, Queen, which was last year here in the UK. If you guys are part of my US audience, then please do check out the description below where we'll have, US release dates as we know them, as they're getting updated. I will continue to put those down in the description along with links. However, Bea and I really connected over Girl, Goddess, Queen. It was a book that you guys know I really liked because it was really clear in that book that Bea is someone who loves Greek mythology, who knows it incredibly well, and knows how to honor it whilst also changing the story at the same time, which is obviously a theme that she continues in her newest release that is sitting just behind me. I am aware that it's fuzzy, so I'll include a photo on screen, which is called The End Crowns All. Now, for this book, we have moved from telling stories of the gods, from telling stories of Hades and Persephone and all of the fun and absurdity of that, and we move into the Trojan War. So none of Bea's books are marketed as retellings. They are absolutely not. They are really taking the myths, having a go with them, asking more what-if questions, and like I said, always pulling it down into the real source material, and then kind of going from there to see how things will change and how the characters, if they acknowledge the real story, or at least if they acknowledge how it will be told, what Bea can do to play on that. Which I think as a classicist, and I know that you guys are nerds who watch my videos, it's something that we really appreciate, is to know that we can trust the author in what they're doing, even if they choose to change things. It's clearly done with good intention, and it is done with, people like Homer in mind in this instance. So before we can actually dive into it with you, Bea, I do just want to let you guys know at home who are watching, we will have two sections of this interview. Bea and I will do a non-spoiler section to begin with, where we will just kind of, going to go through the Trojan War as she told it, the characters that she involves, all of those things that will not spoil the book whatsoever. And then the second half of the interview will move into spoilers. I will let you guys know when that comes up, because I would hate to ruin anything about this book, because quite a bit does change for good reason. So I will come back on to make sure that you guys know about that. However, Bea, now it's about time that actually, these are the wrong way. It's about time that we go over to you for a little bit of context. And for starters with this book, why don't we go into, instead of your background with Greek myth, because we've already done that, why don't we go into how Girl, Goddess, Queen and that journey has taken you now to discussing the Trojan War? Like, what's the connection there? What's the journey like as a writer and through the mythology that has led you to this standalone book as your second young adult book?
So I was first drawn to the Hades and Persephone story via Persephone. I think she's a really interesting character. I love the sort of development from Kore to Persephone, and I knew I wanted to write a young adult book, and I kind of think she's one of the first sort of coming of age stories that you see in Greek myth. So it was more focused on her story and one of the pressures that we place on teenagers and all of that sort of stuff, and the romance, which I know is kind of at the heart of Girl, Goddess, Queen, given it's a fake dating enemies to lovers rom-com, was kind of incidental to Persephone's own journey of self-development and finding her own power. And when I was considering the romance, as well as all the various mythological research that went into it, it was also just the idea of like, this is a book for modern teens, and what sort of content do I want in there? And specifically, how does that romance take place in a way that feels healthy and fulfilling and part of Persephone's journey? So I kind of came to The End Crowns All in a similar way. I was really interested in the character of Cassandra, especially with that sort of, even today we still use the Cassandra complex to explain that people don't take women seriously. And I always think that people get very sort of bogged down in the idea of like, oh, well, if I had her curse, I would have done this and I would have done this. And I was like, but that's not the point, because Cassandra isn't even a character, really. She's just dramatic irony personified. She's just the idea that you know your fate and cannot stop it. But at the same time, like, does she even need the curse? Or would no one have listened to her in the middle of a war anyway because she's a woman? And those were some questions that I went into the story with. And then her pairing with Helen came quite naturally, I think, to the idea of that story, the idea that they are both two women that said no one time, and then there were consequences. Cassandra said no to Apollo, and then he curses her and makes it so that none of her prophecies can be believed. And Helen goes with one man rather than another. And obviously, there are various sources that give that, whether that was consensual or whether it was Aphrodite swaying her heart, or whether that's Aphrodite in a wider way of saying that she fell in love with Paris. But either way, Helen said no to one marriage, and then Menelaus decided that no was not reason enough to not follow her across the ocean and start a war. So they were both just two women that kind of made a decision in a world that didn't want them to make their own decisions. And I wanted to pair them together to fight for that right to say whatever the hell they want, especially the word no.
Okay, so just quickly before we can actually move on, I need to ask like a kind of technical question because it will kind of dictate how I then ask the rest of these questions. Are you somebody who is more so a plotter, or are you like a discovery writer? Like when you sit down with, you know, your blank document, are you going, let's see where the story takes me? Or are you somebody that's like, I need to follow all of these bullet points that I did ahead of time to make sure this story makes sense?
I actually made a video about this recently because I find it interesting. I'm someone that does so much research, especially for my Greek myth reimaginings. And I kind of just have really chaotic, lengthy notes about them all. And I don't just research the myth, I research the historical time period, and I also research sort of thematic things. So obviously, like a large part of this is what's life like for women when men go away to war. So I kind of looked at that through history, because as I say, I was writing with this awareness that I'm writing for a modern YA audience, which definitely impacts things. So I start with the research, kind of have sprawling notes, and I never really stop with the research as I'm going on. But in terms of the actual plan, I really like having a very, very detailed plan that I then completely ignore. I'm very much like I make the plan goes off the rails, throw away the plan. What plan? I have a really good idea of the start and a really good idea of the end. And then I have some points in between, but I'm really character driven and really voice led. So sometimes I find out more about my characters through writing them. So something that I didn't realize was going to be a major part of their journey becomes central. And I especially find that in the romance. I've recently been drafting my next book, codename Pantheon, until I'm allowed to share the title. And there was literally one scene that I was like, and in this scene, they will kiss. And instead, when I wrote the scene, they ended up having a huge argument. And I was like, what happened? What happened to the original plot of the movie? I especially love that I never plan my I love you scenes. It kind of always comes really organically as I'm writing. It's almost like when I, as a writer, fall in love with the idea of their love, almost like when they realize it is when I realize it, and then that's when it like gets laid out on the page. So yeah, I very much sort of find my feet with it. I kind of have to have like a rough outline, and I think as I go, I kind of fill in sort of just on an Excel spreadsheet, like this is what the next few chapters are going to look like. Just sort of like the really barest of bones, a sort of structural outline, I suppose, but I definitely don't hold myself to it. And the End Council was especially tricksy because when I first wrote it, it was a Cassandra reimagining and it was only from Cassandra's point of view. And then my agent was like, can we add in Helen? And that's not as easy as simply just rewriting scenes from Helen's perspective, because if Helen's a point of view character, she needs her own arc, her own journey, her own sort of supporting characters and relationships with the characters that are already existing. So then I was having to sort of plot and structure around what was already a 160,000 word manuscript.
That's just given me anxiety. What are you talking about? I would see that number and be like, actually, maybe I just quit. Maybe that's it.
It
It's
was
done.
absurd. I don't know if you know this, but all of the Iliad is the last 9 months of the war, and I decided I could do the whole thing in a single book.
So you know what? I love this point because something I loved about Girl Goddess Queen as well is that you're so aware of the source material and you're so good at playing with it, but leaving your reader at ease that you know what the source material is, but you're going to kind of weave away from it. And that's a huge aspect of this
Much of a
book.
nerd. Like I'm very much aware that I'm writing in a strange little niche. I kind of see my books as like the stepping stone between Percy Jackson and the sort of adult feminist reimaginings. it's first and foremost for teenagers. It's first and foremost fantasy romance inspired by these stories, as opposed to a retelling or a reimagining. I know all of that stuff is just very trendy for marketing purposes, but these are first and foremost like subversions of myth. They're what if myths. And I think the only reason that you get to write spoilers, but also I really want people to know this has a happy ending. I'm not writing sapphic tragedy. I have no interest in writing sapphic tragedy. They get their happy ending. The only way that you get to write a Trojan War story with a happy ending is because that story is already so well known. Like that story exists in our cultural consciousness in so many different ways. Like a Trojan horse is a common phrase. Cassandra complex is a common phrase. So to sort of subvert that myth, to kind of write in parallel to that myth, almost to hold a mirror up to the really dark story and write in its cracks. I think you just have to make clear on the page where you're deviating away. And because I am such a nerd, I have to flag it because it will anger me if I don't. Like I get really bogged down in research. Like I've gone off on so many tangents about like Bronze Age Greece and like, do they have coins and what's this system? And I'm like, you're writing fantasy romance for teenagers. Go put more attention into like the character dynamics. But like I need to know. And I think that's especially interesting. So Girl Goddess Queen, there's a lot of like, they will tell the story this way. And there's sort of questions about who sort of owns story ownership, but also just making very clear on the page of like, this is what the myth is. Got it? Cool. Now we're going to do this. And I think that's especially fun in the Council because the Iliad is the fated course that they are trying to fight against. And, all the various plays, that's the future that's going to happen. So it's not even sort of altering it in a way, because that version is literally on the page, that is literally written in the threads and the tapestry. So whenever something shifts away from that, it's very clear on the page, like, oh, this tweak has done this to this. You need to know what the original was to make that change.
And also that like characters acknowledge it. Like this is something I said in my review, that like the characters are literally like, whoa, this isn't supposed to happen for another like 9 years. Like this shouldn't be going on. And Cassandra's sitting in the corner like, oh my God, that's so weird. How did that happen? Oh my God, I had no idea that this would happen.
Crazy.
So sticking with Cassandra, she, as you were saying, like is kind of your grounding. Like she was sort of your grounding character to come into it. And she will leave some questions for the spoiler section, guys. So wait around for that so we can talk a little bit more in depth about them. But when it comes to her, she is so true to the myth, and then you strayed slightly from her. So what were things about the mythological character that you loved, that you were really, really set to stick with, just so that people, the nerds who are watching, know, okay, we can expect this Cassandra here?
I think Cassandra is a really, really fun character. And I kind of started with her character with two key pieces. And one is just like the fact of her, which is that sort of from before we meet her, that she was a princess that devoted herself to Apollo. And also part of my writing this is writing it not to steal a turn of phrase, but I did not just fall out of the coconut tree. I exist in the context of all that came before me. And I was aware that there are so many reimaginings of the Trojan War. And for certain characters, decisions I made were based on, okay, we've already seen this character this way. What if it was like this? So instead of having like a Cassandra that was wholly devoted to Apollo, it was instead that sort of question of what options did she have in this world? And it was basically either marriage or priesthood. And I think when you're going in with that awareness that you're writing a sapphic romance, you sort of then make that a part of the character. And she didn't want to go into a marriage. Apollo was her escape route, and she's still very grateful for that. But what does that sort of create in a character? And in my case, it creates someone that's really, really smug about the way that she's figured out this system. And she gets to be both a beloved priestess and also like the princess that everyone fawns over. And then that other fact of her, which is a lot more tragic. So the Trojan women, I love the plays. They are always my favorite part of any Greek myth research. I think because I'm so character driven, I love seeing how different playwrights have established those characters. And in the Trojan women, when the women of Troy are being sort of partitioned off to their captors, Cassandra's being taken by Agamemnon, and she's saying like, don't worry, mother, like it's my wedding night, and just really trying to reassure her mother and not think about herself. So that sort of very caring, very like, I will throw myself in front of whatever fire is coming to my family. Like, I will do my best to not just save other people, but make them not worry about me. Kind of became a real crutch for her character.
And Helen is also so beautifully the ancient Helen as well as your own Helen. You give her so much vulnerability, which I loved seeing in your version, whilst also making her beautifully savage. And my audience knows Savage Helen is my favorite Helen because she's in Homer the whole time. But you really gave her this really like vulnerable note to her character. So can you talk us through that a little bit and why you wanted to focus on that?
I mean, again, like I take inspiration from so many different aspects. So one of them is the fact that when she's kidnapped as a child by Theseus, her brothers start a war to get her back. And I'm like, dear God, like this, there was a war when she was a kidnapped 10-year-old and they still blamed her for it. Like it was still a war in her name. So like, what does that do to a person when like this, when you're sort of constantly feeling out of control in your life, but at the same time, blame keeps being placed at your feet? It's also partly why I absolutely adore the relationship between Helen and Priam. Priam, I found out how to pronounce most of my character names from listening to my own audiobook. Because he's constantly telling her, like, we don't blame you for this, Helen. And I think part of the reason he needs to say that is because she's blaming herself so much. But her character in terms of savagery, again, drawn from like two main instances. Obviously, it's across the board, but there were just two that I really love. And one is in the book, which is when she basically tells Aphrodite that, like, oh, great, what, you're just going to ship me off to the next person? Why don't you marry Paris? Like, yeah, tell her, which also drew pretty much the entire plot of Aphrodite and her involvement, as well as Aphrodite's sort of ancient affiliations with war as well. And then also that bit in the Odyssey, which is also hinted at in the book, where she just straight up poisons people. And also like the fact that when Troy falls, Helen strips her robes and seduces Menelaus because he is going to kill her. Like anyone that's I think there are lots of different versions of how Helen went with Paris, and in some she's kidnapped, and in some she falls in love with him, and in some it's sort of like at the instruction of Aphrodite, and you're not going to say no to a goddess because look how that happened, Paris, with your stupid golden apple. But even in the versions where she's kidnapped, Menelaus is like, I'm going to get you back and kill you to restore my honor, which we don't have time to unpack all of that. We'll throw away the whole trash man. But it was such an intrinsic part of her character of like, she's going to like drop that robe and basically do whatever she needs, be whoever she needs to survive this world, because it's the only way that she's been taught works for her and works for her repeatedly throughout the ancient texts, while at the same time she's always crafting this backup plan and gathering poisons. It presents a sort of preemptive planning to her character that she had these materials lying around because she's been gathering them, because she's been thinking about this. And I just pretty much formed her entire character off of someone that is constantly planning ahead and constantly like shifting whoever she needs to be, which also formed that glorious parallel to the character of Cassandra, who's never had to do that because she figured out the system in a different way.
And a character that you mentioned there, Priam, or again, like you said, Priam. I say Priam. I have heard like legit very big scholars say to me Priam, and then I'm always like, oh no, did I do this
always
wrong?
said Priam, and then it was one that I like argue with my audiobook narrators with. They were like, no, literally everyone says Priam. And I was like, okay.
You know what? Say it however you want to, guys. I'm not going to sit here and tell you how to pronounce it, but his characterization, you know, because I have told you in person, I loved him. And I want to pull up a really beautiful quote from page 418, where you wrote, and it's really short, but I just think it did Priam so well in this quote, where you said, he's talking to Helen. I told you once that I never blamed you for this war, and I won't solve it by selling you off to our invader. And the reason why I love this quote is because you have so much of the old Priam in there and a new Priam, where you've made him such a beautiful father figure to Helen and somebody that like is really accepting and protective of her. So can you talk to us about your characterization of Priam and how you've shifted him into more so this very positive father figure for Helen?
Well, I kind of feel like he is in the original, and I think it's something that, as part of that larger question of what's life like for women when the men go off to war. But in the Iliad, it's not all of the men that go off, because the elders and the council and Priam remain. See, I'm going to coin both in this. And so what's that role? And then you do see it in the Iliad when he's like reassuring her, and that sort of stemmed a lot of my thoughts on his characterization. But also, as I say, 160,000 word manuscript. A lot of things got cut. I think there's like a 600,000 word unabridged version of this somewhere, and something that he had in one of the earlier drafts. And Hecate, who had very different characterization early on, they both sort of had this, and they also had all 100 kids there, which they got cut because that was confusing. And also
enough.
poor Hecate. And Cassandra just had this sort of eldest daughter, like, oh my God, I have to look after all these kids. And it kind of led to this sort of isolation between her and her parents, because Cassandra figured her own way out of the system. Like, she was her own salvation. And I think there's something just generally, and again, with that idea of writing for modern teenagers, the first time you realize that your parents can't save you, the first time you realize that, like, they can't protect you from everything, including sometimes the decisions that you're going to have to make, and what that sort of does. And sometimes that results in this sort of distance. And then also Cassandra, you still definitely see it in this manuscript, but a large part of it is just, she's just really lost. Like, she doesn't have anything to work towards now. She's sort of like, oh, I guess I'll become high priestess one day because that's the only thing available to her. And her parents kind of see that, and they're like, Priam had this sort of thing where he just had, like, which I think is just a very autistic coded dad thing, where he finds like the one interest that a child has and then uses it to bond with them. So like, there were lovely moments of like him finding a scroll for Creusa and like all of this. And they really all take Helen under their wing, and they're like, you are our daughter now, like, we're protecting you. And they just don't know how to approach Cassandra in that same way. And what Cassandra loves is the city. And Helen kind of points this out to him. And then Priam and Cassandra start going on these walks through the city, and it was just really lovely. And even though I had to take that out, I still really loved that core of him as someone who like genuinely is really like, and again, with the idea that they kill Paris off and then can't do it again the second time, both of them are someone that like really, really love their kids, but also really don't know how to handle anything in their kids' lives, was sort of an intrinsic part of the characters. And as I say, Hecate definitely shifted a lot, unfortunately. But I think she needed to explore the things that I needed to explore with Cassandra's character. But I did try, let the record show that after writing very, very complicated Demeter, where I was like, look, we're not doing the retelling thing where we're making Demeter the monster, but we are asking questions of what good motherhood looks like in this ancient world, and intergenerational trauma, especially when it's misogynistic trauma, when you can't tell your daughter she can be whatever she wants to be because she can't, and that will get her hurt, what that does. I was like, cool, we're going to do a really healthy mother-daughter relationship in this one. Didn't happen, but I tried.
Well, you brought this up, and I'm so thrilled that you did, but you mentioned Creusa. Talk about like my obsession of a subplot. I think that was like the first text I sent you when I was reading. I was like, what is happening here? I love them. So before we can talk about her and Aeneas, though, you're going to have to explain to the nerds, Bea, why did you have to change the spelling of the name? Because there's a very good reason for
Oh
this.
my God, yeah. For the same reason that Helenas is Commandrios. My team, bless them, not myth nerds, which is actually brilliant because they get to be like, nerd alert, this is too confusing for the average reader. And partly it was just the mammoth cast. But they said that Cassandra and Creusa were too audibly similar, so they and too visually similar on the page rather, when spelt with C's, so I changed her to the K spelling, just to give a sort of visual difference on the page, because I do agree it was confusing to the point that like sometimes I would write the wrong name, and similarly Scamandrios, they were like, you cannot have Helen and Helenus in the same book, and I was like, take it up with Homer, like, not my problem. So I changed that.
So now bring us to the source. Bring us to
Yes.
Creusa and Aeneas. Tell us about your characterization of them. Did you always want to include them in the story? Was that a surprise to you? Because they were so beautiful and so real, and like watching them and have their little budding side relationship at the same time as Helen and Cassandra, I just felt like made the book so like gush worthy.
Well, there's not loads on Creusa, which is why I was like, great, a blank slate for me to fill in all my fun characterizations. And again, like something that sometimes you have to do things for the sake of like a book and a plot and to explore the things that you want to explore and still pay homage to the original. But also, I think, as I say, like Cassandra is less a character than dramatic irony personified. And I think sometimes when you approach characters like that and you're like, okay, what's the purpose of this character? And I think Creusa is just like, this is what Aeneas lost in the war. So that was sort of like the only thing I had to go on. I was like, okay, I don't love Aeneas of the Aeneid, but I was like, what if he became a terrible person because the love of his life died in the war? Which is not anything I will ever forgive anyone for, but it was a good starting point for the characters. And I think the Trojan War and what happens to the Trojan women and the whole fall of Troy is so unbearably horrific, that when you're sort of writing this, and I think that actually comes through a lot. Like, it was definitely a driving power in the book. Whenever Cassandra is like, just this once, can we not have a happy ending? I think it was coming from just like a heart that's held too much tragedy. Like, I love the ancient Greek myths, but they are so loaded with tragedy. And you feel that yearning and that hope and just like on your knees begging, like, please, just this once. And yeah, why not just this once? So to sort of come to that and go, okay, well, if we really, really want to like save this, and I do think by like holding that up, you do, like, as you say, like, I obviously know the text and I'm making changes, and I think the tragedy is still in the book, and it's in the book every single time Cassandra is like, just this once, can't we end it differently? Every time she's seeing that future laid out in front of her, that's where the tragedy is. It's sort of in the margins. It's in between the lines on the page. It lingers within the pages, even if it's not down in words. And so part of that was, okay, well, what's this city? What's this life that they're trying to save? What is it that means so much to them? And then you sort of bring in these elements of like romance that's happening in the court and all of these other aspects. So yeah, I knew that Aeneas and Creusa's relationship was going to form a core part of the subplot. I think, again, just a lot of the changes, and I know you're going to ask me questions, have the very simple answer of to make it a YA book because they have to be teenagers. So they're teenagers and they're falling in love, and it's great. And I love Creusa so much. She is so much fun. And Aeneas as well is just completely besotted with her, and does not know how to do this at all. And also he's the son of Aphrodite, so that adds in like a really fun dynamic, especially with like the way that Aphrodite is tormenting Helen. And then so in the original there was Cassandra, who's obviously got her romance at the center. There's Andromache and Hector, but they're already together. And then there was Laodice and Creusa that were both sort of falling in love for the first time. And then Laodice got whacked because, as I say, 600,000 words. So hers now happens way before she's already gone. She's already done that. And hers was just really fun because, again, like Creusa, there's very little down on the page about her. And all that's really there is that, according to 3 different sources, she's married to 3 different men. So she had this like love quadrangle going on, that was just taking up too much space on the page. And it was really driven by like, let's show what life is like in Troy. And I wanted to write this really like vibrant, almost family drama, to really show the sort of the humanity and the human impact of war and of the tragedy and of the gods using the mortals as their little playthings. And just in between them, there's this just really, really cute romance between Aeneas and Creusa, where she's like, I have such a soft spot in my heart. I think there's actually down on the page where Creusa realizes that she likes Aeneas and then has a breakdown, and Cassandra's like, Creusa seems to be not coping well with the fact that she's in love with the guy we've all been telling her she's in love with for the last 2 years. It's like they're so clearly in love, but she's like, no, I hate him. He's annoying. And then he's like, will you dance? And she's just like, I don't know how to cope with any of this.
Honestly, the cutest. I could honestly have just done this whole interview about them, which wouldn't be about the book. And so therefore I was like, we'll just do one question.
I cannot shout this enough. It's not a tragedy. They get their happy ending too. I don't do queer tragedy, and Creusa is trans, so she's got the queer protection, the queer plot armor of me not writing queer tragedy.
And before we move into any spoilers, we've got to address one character just very generally, because again, I could dedicate a whole interview just to this character. Can you tell us a bit about your Apollo, please?
I think it's a really interesting one, for lots of different reasons. And obviously I love Apollo in myth. He's one of my favorite gods. But the myths about him vary so much. And unfortunately, in the Trojan War, he is an arsehole. So that's where that stemmed from. It was this idea of like Cassandra saying no and then him cursing her. Obviously then evolves into sort of him continuously chasing her through the book because, as I say, I'm writing for modern teenagers. So let's write about a boy that doesn't take no for an answer, but also is sort of just badgering you and coercing you and just so entitled, because I think he rings a bell in a lot of us for a lot of men that we've all met. He is the guy that can't stand being friend zoned. And that is something that I really lent into in the book, because he and Cassandra genuinely really get along. They really have very good chemistry in the way that like they bounce off of each other. Their repertoire is so sharp. But she's like, I'm an asexual lesbian, like friends. And he's like, no, even though he is losing literally everything because Troy is a city sacred to him, he sides with the Trojans, but nearly his entire family sides with the Greeks. And he's really lonely. And Cassandra becomes like the one person he can sort of go to in that sort of like, you know, I can tell you whatever because A, you're immortal, and B, no one believes a thing you say. So you're now my confidant. Like you now have a use for me. But I will keep just like tormenting you until you say yes. So he was just sort of born of this like entitlement, the friend zone guy that can't accept that friendship is a good thing and not a second prize. And then also I kind of wrote him in the way that a lot of the romantic heroes of YA are written, because I kind of wanted to explore the fact that a lot of the sort of behavior that we're shown as hot is actually really creepy and predatory. So think of characters like the Darkling. Obviously, that's not a romantic hero, but like very much that sort of vibe of just writing him in that really sort of like won't say no for an answer, take no for an answer, but in the way that we're sort of taught that that's like a sign that he's like really committed to you. And it's like, no, creepy, gross, don't do it. Because as I say, I'm writing for modern teenagers.
Okay, B, this is my cue to come back on and to let everybody at home know we are now going to move into spoilers before we continue. Because I do not want to ruin the book. As I said at the start of this, that would be the absolute worst thing. This book is so special and so fun and so vibrant. So if you have not read The End Crowns All, you guys can check out the description below where I have linked everything that I can find regarding the book, as well as obviously Bea's socials. I will be uploading my own personal review of The End Crowns All. That will also be linked down there in case you guys wanted to watch that as a separate video, along with the videos that I have previously recorded with Bea last year for Girl, Goddess, Queen. So there's a lot down there that you guys can continue watching if you are impressed with Bea, which hopefully we have done a good job in showing you that, because I am always and will continue to be so unbelievably impressed by Bea and her ability to take the Greek myths and to be so creative and so fun with them whilst continuing to draw in the original stories. So on that front, we will love you and leave you, but that means it is just us nerds here who have read The End Crowns All, and we can get into some more sticky spoilers for the book and kind of unpack those with you, Bea. So why don't we start really easy? We'll start with a general question. And this general question will be, what was your favorite scene in the book to write? Because this means that you can pick one from the start of it if you want to, but I kind of wanted to give you full reign to just, tell us whatever it is about the book that you really enjoyed writing or that you were most impressed with. What was that scene that still now you're like, yes, I did that?
I kind of just love the entire end. And like, I'm sure I can get like more specific, but like, I'll do a more specific scene, but the end did not change much from edit to edit. And like, that's a lot when you're like dealing with that. And I think especially because I decided it was going to have a happy ending, that was like a huge thing to figure out. And I kind of looked at what various happy endings in myth look like. I considered, maybe they both get turned into birds, but that didn't feel very satisfactory. It was like, oh, I made the underworld quite nice in Girl, Goddess, Queen. Maybe they should just die, but it's cool because they're in paradise now. And I was like, no, not the happy ending I'm going for. But to bring in, I think, especially given so many of the men that make up the ending are off page for nearly the entire book. They exist in memories or in lines. To kind of make that feel like an immediate threat. It was like the horror that's been whispering at the walls, present and intruding. I really loved writing that and capturing all of that tension and anger. And I am allowed to spoil things, right?
Yeah, we're in spoilers now.
To specifically spoil, something that brought me great joy is, as I say, like a lot of the changes had to be made because it was YA, and then a lot of changes had to be made to sort of fit the sort of character arcs. So given that Agamemnon cannot take Cassandra away, I'm like, well, Bea needs to die, and I'm so sorry. Clytemnestra has had the joy of killing him in every single version of this story, and just this once, Briseis is going to get her go. And so that brought me, like, we've heard of this girl like 3 times, but I was like, for the Greek myth girlies, like, just this once, she gets to stab him.
Did you ever worry about the ending? Because you do, you change obviously the entire ending of it, where Menelaus and Agamemnon die on Trojan soil, as opposed to going home. And since we know that you're a nerd, I know that you're a nerd, we've established that you know the source material so well and you acknowledge it constantly. Was there ever the nerd in you that was like, I know I'm writing YA, but like, should I do it this way?
I think because the nerdiness sort of was allowed to foster even in that moment. Like there's a moment where Helen's like, I hear Egypt is lovely this time of year, in a sort of, because there are that version of the book where like actually Helen's just been like a simulacrum this entire time and her and Paris are just off on shore. So like you don't have to go tell the men that he's died. You can just say that we've gone on holiday for a bit. So like even when I'm like altering the story, that's still with that awareness of like, you can say whatever, like, and I think the gods, like Apollo does say, he's like, you'll all be dead in a few years and then we'll tell the story we want to tell. There's this idea that even within this altered timeline, it could still end up where we are today, where this is the story we know, because who gets to tell those stories? It's the men that make it back to shore, especially, given that it's so many of our texts come from Athens specifically. There's this idea that the men will just stay on shore for 10 years to rebuild their boats, and then they'll go off and be like, yeah, honey, we won the war.
And the quote that you were just talking about, I wrote that one down because I was like, I love that mention of Egypt. That's page 551 for anybody that has the book in front of them, because obviously if you're in this section, you should at least have the book or have read it. So page 551, I loved that nod. I thought it was so subtle and so beautifully woven into the story. Again, shows how well you know the source material. What was like your favorite little nod to another myth regarding Greek mythology or the Trojan War that you managed to like shoehorn in, that you were like, yes?
Oh God, that's such a good question. Well, I do really love getting Hades and Persephone in as a little cameo appearance, just because when Helen's kidnapped and she's sort of left with Theseus's mother while they go off to the underworld, I was like, well, what if she went with them just so that we get to meet them? Um, so I really enjoyed that. I'll tell you what my favorite one was. I loved getting in the idea that Athena and Pallas were in love. I loved just being able to weave that in because the Palladium is such a huge part of Troy. And the Trojans sort of assume it's a statue of Athena because Pallas Athene. And then when Cassandra meets Athena, she's like, that doesn't look like you. And Athena's like, her name was Pallas, and it's like a really soft mention. And I don't really know overall how I consider her sexuality wise, whether this was like, an arrow ace, like queer platonic relationship, or fully like a, allosexual, sexual, sapphic romance. However you want to interpret that is fine. I just really loved, I think there's a bit where it's like, to take her name and make it a part of yourself, that like even in death, like Athena's love for her goes on. I really love being able to weave that in just from the fact that Troy has the Palladium.
No, it was so sweet. And like you said, like soft nods, like there's so many just like soft little mentions throughout the book that I was like, beautiful, love this, adorable. But there was one change that I wanted to talk about as well, and that was you introduced this idea that Cassandra has letters that plays a role in the Greeks coming to get Helen. Can you talk a little bit more about that and where that idea came from?
Yes. So part of the romance between Helen and Cassandra stems from this idea of the rivals to lovers trope, specifically where Cassandra's like, I don't need anyone to believe me or not. I can get rid of you myself. So that sort of escalated, and it wasn't really landing for several edits. So the editorial feedback was like, can we just keep making this more, like make her do something truly, truly awful? And I was researching something else. I was reading about Gorgo, and there was this part about secretly coded messages that were sent on the battlefield through these wax tablets, where once you wiped the wax away, the inscriptions were like written on the wood beneath. And I was like, that's really fun. And I kind of wanted to build that into the book, and I do. And that's sort of how Penelope and Odysseus fell in love, as a little nod to that. And then as soon as the idea of like secret inscriptions and letters were introduced, that's when I was like, okay, well, what if Cassandra reaches out to Menelaus and is like, yo, dude, got your wife, come pick her up. And, you know, Helen is like, that's really stupid for XYZ when she finds out. But Cassandra is just so desperate. I think it's more a sign of her desperation. And I did try to make it clear, just like timeline wise, that like, you know, Helen has this wariness of like, why hasn't he come after me? Like, he would have done something. And he was assembling the boats to Greece. So I don't think Cassandra's letter was what made him be like, quick, let's assemble the troops, because he was already doing that. I think he was just like, oh, nonsense woman, like, we're going to come take your entire city anyway. But yeah, that's where that kind of came from.
So of all your characters, who's the one that surprised you the most as you were writing?
Ooh, strong. I think Huckabee, just because her characterization varied so much. And then it reached the point of like, I knew that Cassandra's prophecies were going to be sort of symbolic of the really loud parts of both mental health and neurodivergence, which are very different things. But I could see them being symbolic of, say, Tourette's, of schizophrenia, of psychosis, of having a meltdown in public, you know, like the parts of like, everyone wants to romanticize anxiety, but when you're got snot running down your face because you're having a panic attack and you think no one wants to see that. And I kind of knew that Cassandra was emblematic of all of those things. And so Huckabee then became emblematic of the system that tells us we don't want to see those things. And I was able to explore in her relationships. I still wanted to give Cassandra the support network. So she has it with her sister. She has it with Andromache, where she's telling Helen that like just inviting Cassandra to this space isn't enough. We need to actively undo the way that society has told her no one wants her here. And so that sort of surprised me coming from Huckabee, I suppose, just because of the original iteration. But I really kind of like the way that that was on the page, because it felt like we were just critiquing society a lot through the relationship that Cassandra has with her mother, especially that idea of like, I know what's best for you. It's a kindness, like we're creating a safe space for you, but the safe space is in the tower, far away from anyone. Like I think anyone that has any experience with being other in that way has experience with something very similar to that sort of isolation, not for you, but cruelty in the name of kindness, which is not kind at all.
Okay, so just thinking back a few answers ago, I actually want to bring it back. Sorry, guys, this is a bit chaotic of me, but I want to bring it back to the ending of
Yes.
the book, because you know, you've been talking a lot about like looking at women in war throughout history and everything, but you certainly do quite a few nods at the end to not only just women in history, but women throughout ancient history and how they've, or at least how we've been told that they've handled war in these great stories. Can you kind of pull these elements out for us a little bit more and kind of touch on those? Because I think it's really subtle that people might miss
You
it.
see the grounding force of the ending. I felt very much like I was just asking my readers to bear with me, because I did feel a bit like, guys, I know this is ridiculous, or everyone in Troy is just climbing into statues, but also like that is basically what happened with the Trojan War, so I feel like I can. I'm so sorry. I know this is absurd, but so is the Trojan horse. So I felt like the counterbalance to that was to build in some like actual ancient sort of ways of dealing with invaders, especially for women, because there's not loads about your average woman when war happens, other than just cities falling and them being enslaved. But you do get sort of accounts of women lining the rooftops and throwing tiles at their invaders. So there's a part where Cassandra's basically reweaving fate, and she's kind of taking little snippets from other places to patch it through. So that's one of them. There's the poet Telesilla, who was part of the defense of Argos in 494 BC, where basically all the men went off to war, died, and then it was like the women and the old people of Argos defending the city from the attackers, and they succeeded according to the legend. So there's that. Like, there are genuine moments in recorded history that play parallel to how it all goes down in the ending. So it has some grounding in the absurdity that follows.
Okay, but we love the absurdity. That's why we all read myths. Like you said, you know, like there are so many things that are put forward in myth that are just ridiculous. And you really do have to like And I say this all the time on my channel. I'm like, just look, this is not the weirdest thing you're going to face. So you need to accept this, and you're going to come up with something weirder, and that's okay. Just accept it. It's myth.
They all just like sail off into the sunset, but there's very clearly on the page, like, we need to get Aeneas out. I've seen that he can lead us somewhere. And it's just like, hey guys, you know this? What if we just expanded what we already have, which is Aeneas heading off to Italy?
Well, speaking of riding off into the sunset, you've now released Tekka. So for my American audience, we will be linking the dates for the American release in the description below so that you guys know about all of that coming up when the news comes out, of course.
Yeah.
But you are not only a YA author. I wanted to slightly pivot to let people know a little bit about your newer adult release.
I have. Do I have a US? Yes. If you're in the US, this will be coming out like now. This is my adult thriller, that makes it sound erotica. It's just because I write YA, so I'm like, oh, this is my adult book. I'm like, no, God, no, that's not what I mean. This is my thriller debut, Then Things Went Dark, which is about a murder on a reality TV show. And it's very much not now, so please don't hold me to this, but it began as dark academia. So the characters are all very pretentious, but also, as dark academia has its roots in ancient tragedy, that has sort of remained, even though it is no longer dark academia. It's sun-kissed, it's vibrant, it's messy. It is sort of like if you took the characters from a dark academia and put them on Love Island. They are all so self-absorbed, so obsessed with themselves, so obsessed with doing whatever they need to do to steal even a minute of screen time. So they are acting up and acting out, and one of them dies live on air. And I didn't realize quite how dark Greek tragedy it was until our friend's husband read it and was like, yeah, and you have like the chorus of like the social media, and I was like, I have a chorus. So I hope you'll enjoy it. It's satirical. It is very much like these people are the worst, but it is very queer. It's not bury your gays if they're all gay, was my mantra. So yeah, that's coming out like now, as we speak.
Well, my audience love a subtle nod. I always talk about the subtle nod books as well. And so the minute that it was like our friend's husband had said, oh my God, this is so Greek tragedy, I was like, interesting. We can definitely tie this in and figure out a way to get all the nerds on it.
Oh, like, why did you do this? And I was like, well, I wrote Girl Goddess Queen, and then I wrote Then Things Went Dark, and then I wrote The End Crowns All, and then I got book deals for all of them. And I was like, whoa, what? I'm tired. Like, it wasn't like, oh, I write Greek myth YA and now I am going to look to debut in a new genre. It sort of all happened at once. I just wrote lots of different books. I have plenty of books that I hadn't sold. And I was like, yeah, this is just like, I wrote this because I love, dark academia. I love messy characters. I love awful people. And then now that it's like coming out within the context of the YA, I'm like, oh yeah, it's ancient tragedy. Like, even when I'm trying to do something different, it still gets its little claws into me.
So then for the people who are watching, that we can give them a piece of advice to leave on, since, as you just mentioned, 3 books, all of them got deals. You've also worked in publishing, so you know it from the other side as well. If there's somebody who's watching that has watched you as well, grow into this incredible author, what is the advice that you can give them for their own manuscript if they're working on something and they want it to be kind of Greek myth either inspired or, a retelling?
I think it's especially prescient in the Greek myth market, but just generally, like, keep your eyes on the page. This is a very chaotic industry. The only thing you can control is the writing that you are writing. It's easy to caught up in what other people are doing. I know, look at the Greek myth market, for example. How many retellings of Clytemnestra are they? I imagine every single one of those writers had a moment where they saw the other one announced and was like, oh God, what does this mean for my book? But no one was doing it in the specific way that they were doing it. Girl Goddess Queen took over a year on submission before it sold. Like, this is just a really messy, chaotic industry. And the only thing that you have control over and that you should be finding passion in is putting word after another word. And, just making the writing shine and focusing in on your craft as much as possible.
That's such a lovely note to end on, Bea. What a good piece of advice. And I'm so glad that we have been able to offer that little tidbit to you all who are still sticking around, as well as obviously thanking you, Bea, endlessly for joining me once again. I know that you were in the throes of publicity for this book, and the fact that you took a little bit of time on your free day to sit down with me is always incredibly, incredibly special. So thank you all at home for watching so much, for continuing to support the channel. As I have continuously said throughout the video, you can find all of the links in the description below. Please, please do not be shy to check those out, to follow both me and Bea on other platforms, to stay up to date, as well as obviously, I didn't mention this earlier, but you can find links to And Then Things Went Dark down in the description as well. And you will see it all over Bea's socials since that is coming out right about now. Thank you guys so much, and I'll be seeing you next time with more videos here on MoAn Inc. I'll see you guys then.